Hello, and welcome to the second lesson in the Intro to Houdini course. Today, we're going to learn about modeling with some basic expressions and procedural effects. By the end of the lesson, you'll be familiar with modeling techniques and some basic surface operators, and we're going to learn that by making a chandelier. Specifically, we're going to be making this chandelier. And the reason that we're going to be learning by modeling this today is because it's basically made up of some very basic shapes, and it has repeating features as well. So we can take advantage of Houdini's node-based workflow to make a chandelier model that has editable attributes. So in this case, we're going to be able to edit the number of these arms here that come out of the chandelier, and we'll also be able to, we're going to add a chain to the top of it that has a variable length to it. And here is how we're going to do it. To create the chandelier, we're going to be doing it in 6 basic steps. Now the first step is going to be modeling the arm. And the arm is going to be important to do first because it sort of defines the overall profile and shape of the chandelier. So without that, we're not going to know where to place any of the other elements. The second step we're going to do is we're going to copy the arm. And this is where we're going to just make duplicates of the arm in a circle so that it fleshes out the whole shape of the chandelier. The third step is adding details to the arm. And this is where we're going to be adding the details that make up the features of the arm. The first one being the bowl. That's what the candle sits on top of. The second detail is going to be then the candle, obviously. And finally, we're going to be modeling the flame on top of the candle. Once we've fleshed out the arm, there are a couple of miscellaneous overall details on the chandelier that are not part of the arm. And that would be the bands that go across the middle, the ring on the top, and then the canopy on the top. And I guess if we're being technical, we have to model the canopy first before we model the ring. And then the fifth thing that we have to model is the chain. And for this, we're just going to model one link of the chain, and then in a similar fashion, from copying the arm, we're going to have a variable length on the chain. So once we've done this, I said there were 6 basic steps. The 6th step that we have to do is create custom parameters. And this is where we're going to take these arm copies, and we're also going to take the chain, and we're going to be adding these custom parameters to our model so that we can quickly edit the number of arms and then the length of the chain. So when we add these custom parameters, we'll be able to very quickly add and remove arms on the chandelier, change the length of the chain so that we can determine exactly how long we want the chandelier hanging down from the ceiling. So that's a lot of things to cover, so we're going to want to get started. So now that we're back in Houdini, the first step we're going to do is model the arm. Now if we take a look at our chandelier model here again, the arms are kind of these really long curvy pieces of metal. So the best way that we're going to be able to accomplish this is by drawing a curve. So that's going to be our first step. Up here in the Create shelf, if you find the Curve tool and click on it, we can sort of zoom out and look at our grid here. And we're just going to draw the basic shape of the arm of the chandelier. So I'm going to click once, and I'm just going to roughly try to stay on this center line here. So that's going to be the main body of the arm. And I'm just clicking to add points. I guess it curves up and then out and then around and under. When you're done drawing your curve, you can hit enter, and yeah, that looks pretty close. It's not exact, but we could always go back and edit it later if we needed to. That'll be an advantage of Houdini. If we don't like our curve, we can always refine it at a later step without having to destroy any of what we've worked on before. So the first thing I want to do with this curve is it's laying sort of flat on the ground here, and I actually want this this part of the arm here pointing straight up and down. So what I need to do is I need to select the curve here in the node editor, and I'm going to double click on it. If you remember from our previous lesson, we're now in the geometry view instead of the scene view. When we do our modeling, pretty much everything that we're going to be covering today is going to happen in the geometry level. And that's because modeling takes place using surface operators, or SOPs, and those live in the geometry level. So the first one that I'm going to introduce is called transform. So if we just hit tab in the node editor and type in the word transform, and we can select transform and place it, and then link the nodes together. We now have some handles on the curve that we can use to rotate it. Remember, like I shared in the first lesson, we could either use the manipulators here in the viewport window, or we could just type in the number in the parameter view. For something like rotating it exactly 90 degrees, it's probably quickest just to type the number here in the parameter view instead of grabbing the handle here and trying to navigate it exactly to 90 degrees. So I'm just going to type in 90 in the X rotation, and it's dipping pretty far below the construction plane. Not that that really matters a whole lot, but I'm just going to grab it and bring it up a little here. Okay, perfect. So the second step is you'll probably notice that our curve is kind of jagged. I didn't take a whole lot of care in making it very smooth, and that's because we really don't have to in our first step make it very smooth. If we're working with curves, Houdini gives us a very nice node called smooth, and it actually works with a lot more things than just curves. If we hook up our smooth node and crank up the smoothing iterations, you can see that our curve gets smoother, but you can also see that we've got a really huge problem in that now our curve looks nothing like what it did before. And it's doing this because we are smoothing on a fairly small number of points. If I hit the S key and bring up point selection here, we can see that I don't have a whole lot of points. The smooth function doesn't actually add any more detail to the curve we had before. So if we want to have a smooth curve but not have it mess up what we did before, there's actually a node we need to insert before the smooth node, and it's called a resample. So I'll just type resample, hit enter, and place it here. The resample node is just going to add more detail to the curve. That way we can smooth it without losing our original shape. Now if you find yourself in the situation where you've already got two nodes hooked up together and you don't really want to go through the process of breaking the previous connection, moving the new node in, and then re-hooking everything up, there's actually a much quicker way you can do that. So if you've already got two nodes connected but you sort of want another node between them, all you have to do is drag it in between the connection until the line turns yellow, and then just drop it in and it will insert the node between the previous two nodes. So now that I've dropped the resample node in, our curve is looking a lot smoother, and we've kept all the the original shape that we drawn in the first place. Just want to quickly look at the parameters in the resample node. If this gave you too much detail, or if it didn't give you enough detail, you could always change the segment length here. In our case, 0.1 is working perfectly, but if you really wanted, you could add more or less by messing with this number. Although I would not, for a curve of this size anyway, I wouldn't change it a whole lot, because small changes are going to affect it pretty drastically. So just be on the lookout for that if you are editing your maximum segment length here. So we've got a good shape for the curve now, but it's just a line, and we're going to need some actual thickness here for the model. Again, if we look back at our chandelier model, this iron bar, or whatever metal it's made out of, is just a circular profile. So that's pretty easy to do. So here in the geometry view, I'm going to click in here, and I'm going to add a circle node. It's just a simple primitive. You can see it made a circle here. It's not really the size or the position that we want it to be, but that's actually okay for what we're going to do with it. Because we're not actually going to we're not going to hook up the smooth node to the circle node. Instead, what we're going to do is we are going to add a sweep node. Now the sweep node is going to take the circle, and it's going to make a bunch of copies of it along the path that we give it. So for the first, and here, actually let me zoom in a little bit so we can see a little better. For the first input of the sweep node, we want to put the circle. And then for the second input, we want to put the smooth node. And then when we turn the sweep node on, we can see it has indeed copied the circle along the curve. Now the circle is way too big, so we can select the circle and change its radius down by quite a lot more than that. Just making sure it doesn't go into the negatives here, because it'll look kind of weird if it's backwards. That looks about a good diameter. Again, we can always change it later on if we think it's too big or too small. Now this has just made a bunch of copies of the circle. It hasn't actually made a, like a bar like we want it to do. So to connect the circles together, we need to use a node called skin. So we'll drop a skin node in, connect the first input to the sweep node, and turn it on. And we see that nothing happens. And you might find this kind of problem happening an awful lot when you're first starting out modeling in Houdini. And that's because a lot of these nodes, they need very specific inputs. So if we look at our circle here, the primitive type is a primitive, and it's the skin node isn't liking that. So what we actually need to do is change the primitive type to a polygon, so that the skin node can work on it. Okay, let me take the selection off here. So now we can see that we have our arm shape. If we look at the ends of it though, we'll notice that the tube is hollow on the top, and it's actually hollow on the bottom here as well. In order to fix the holes that we have in the end caps here, it's actually a very simple checkbox that we need to make sure we have selected. So select the skin node and just make sure that keep primitives is checked, and that way the end caps will stay the same. There's one final thing that you might notice about the arm, and that is that the model looks black, and traditionally all of the models that we work with just kind of look like a flat shaded gray. So if you see that something looks black, That's because the normals are reversed, which is just kind of a way of saying that the model is inside out, and that each of the individual faces here is pointing inside the model rather than outwards. So that's actually a really simple fix too. All we need to do is add a reverse node. And you'll see the model's turned gray, meaning that we fixed it. So with that, the arm is actually finished. Now we can go on to our second step, which is copying the arm. So there's two important things that we're going to do. We're going to control the number of copies of the arm, and we're going to control the Y rotation about this Y axis. So if we look at our picture again, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 6 arms, so we're going to need 6 copies. The way we're going to do that is we're going to drop down. Oops, I can't spell. We're going to drop down a copy node. And those 2 parameters I was talking about are right here. Number of copies is up here, and then rotation is down here. And here's how you use those. So number of copies, we had said we want 6. And then for the rotation, we're going to need to find a Y value to have all of these copies evenly spaced. We could click and drag and sort of fan them out until we found a spacing that looked pretty good. But you don't actually just have to type numbers in here. Houdini will accept some simple formulas. So what we could do is, since we need a full 360 degrees covered by 6 arms, we can just type in 360 divided by 6 and hit enter, and then it will space them all out very evenly. And this looks pretty good, except for the fact that so our chandelier has 6 arms, but what if we had made the chandelier and then someone came back and said, actually we want the chandelier to have 4 arms or 8 arms? Well, this approach isn't really going to work if we need to change the number later. And so this is where expressions are going to be really useful. We're going to want the rotation to change automatically based on the number of copies that we give it up here. And to do that, we're going to use something called channel referencing. Each of these parameters that you see here have one or multiple channels. So that's all that means. That's all that we mean by channel referencing, is that one of the parameters is going to look at the value of another parameter to decide how it's going to behave. So to reference a channel in the same node, it's pretty simple. We're going to do everything inside this copy node. We're going to hover over the parameter that we want. So in this case, the rotation is dependent on the number of copies. So we need to know what we're going to need to know the parameter name for number of copies. If we put our mouse on that and hover over, a little info box pops up, and it says the parameter is NCY. So down here in our rotation, instead of 360 divided by 6, we can say 360 divided by the channel reference to number of copies. Now to do that in the same node, we do $, and then we do NCY. Oops, that's NYC. NCY. Now if you just type this in, it's going to give you an error, and that's because if you're going to do channel references inside of Houdini, within the same node, you need to make sure that you have put all of the letters in all caps. So we actually want NCY. And you see that the text changed from a red color to this yellow color. That means that whatever you've typed in, that Houdini can actually find the parameter. So if it's red, that means you've made an error. If it is yellow, that means you've probably typed the right word. So if we hit enter, nothing's actually going to change here on the surface. But now if we edit our number of copies, we're going to see that all of the arms space out very evenly. whereas before, if we only had 360 divided by 6, and then we change the number of copies, we're not really going to see anything because, it's just placing copies on top of one another. Let me just go back, put this at NCY. And 14 is just a crazy number, so let's put it back down to 6. So cool. That is almost looking perfect, except that we have all of the arms are intersecting one another when they reach the middle here. It would be rather tedious to try to move all of these copies individually. So all we have to do is go back to, go back to just when we have the one arm, and add a transform node again. Place it before the copy, and if you add a transform node and hit T to get your translation tool, and you don't see any handles to move the geometry, just look over here, and there's a button called Show Handle. So if you click it, it will toggle it on and off. So we'll just show the handle, and we can click and drag this to the right a little bit to offset it, and then go back and look at our copy, and that looks pretty good. In fact, we can actually just select the transform node with the visibility on the copy, and move this left and right just to check the spacing. And I think they all pretty much meet up with one another. Actually, it looks like there is a little bit of a gap. So let's just make sure that there's a little bit of a gap. Alright, that's looking good. The next thing we need to do is add the details to the arm. So if we remember, there were 3 major details that we were going to add to the arm. The first one is this bowl that sits on top of the arm. The second is the candle, and then the third is the flame sitting on top. So we'll just do that in that order from bottom to top. Bowl, candle, flame. Lucky for us, this bowl shape is really simple. It looks like just the bottom part of a sphere, so we're just going to use the bottom part of a sphere. Now, if you start this by just clicking the sphere button up here in the shelf tools, it's not really going to give you what you want. So if we drop a sphere in, we can see it took us back to the scene view. And now we have our curve object, which doesn't really resemble a curve anymore, so let's just call it chandelier. I think I've spelled it right. I probably spelled it wrong. I'm very awful at spelling. So we have our chandelier, and then we have our sphere, but the sphere is, it's not actually part of the chandelier, right? If we move it around, it's a completely separate object. So what we want to do instead is go back into the geometry level and drop down a sphere by hitting the tab key in the node network rather than using the shelf tool. So we will make a sphere and toggle the visibility on, and let's start to make our bowl. We're going to switch the primitive type from primitive to polygon mesh, just so it's a little easier to work with. And now, since the bowl really just looks like the bottom part of a sphere, we are going to just chop off the top of the sphere. Right now we're looking at the perspective view, and it would be a lot more helpful if we switched our view to the front viewport. So we can either do that, but by clicking on the current view, going to set view, and then selecting the viewport here. Or if you see on the side, it tells you what the hotkeys are for looking at different viewports. So 1 for perspective, 2 for top, 3 for front. If we just have our mouse in the viewport, use, the one, oh, I'm sorry, don't actually want to just hit the 1 key. You want to hit the spacebar and the 1 key, spacebar 3, spacebar 2, etc. To switch your camera around the different viewports. So spacebar 3 will put us in the front view, and with our sphere selected, we're going to hit S so that we can select the components of the sphere, and just make sure that we are on select primitives. We're going to draw a box about down to here, and then just hit the delete key. And that's going to delete the top selection of the sphere, and it's going to make you see a blast node over here. A blast node just means that we've deleted parts of the object that we had selected. I'm going to go back into the perspective view here. So the bowl looks pretty good. We could actually edit the shape a little bit. Right here it looks pretty flat, and our sphere is looking a lot more, a lot taller than it does in our reference model. So we will select everything here again, and then just press E to bring up our scale tools, and we want to just scale along the Z-axis here. Kind of make our bowl a little more flat. That looks pretty close. Yeah. Okay, now we have the same problem we had when we just had a curve, and that is it looks like a bowl, but it's it's paper thin, and nothing should be thin. We need to add some thickness to it. To do that, we can go to the shelf tools in under polygons. If we go all the way to the left, there is a poly extrude, or we could just drop the poly extrude node down in the network editor. It doesn't really make a difference which way you do it. For simple stuff like this, I prefer to use the button on the shelf, but to each his own. So with everything selected, click on poly extrude, and nothing happened. We have to go over here to global, and then translate. Just translate down on the y-axis here, just to give it a little bit of thickness. So we've given it thickness, but there is a giant hole where we want the top of the bowl to be. And to fix that, all you have to do is up here check the output back option, and that will make a backside to the bowl. The last little detail we want to add to the bowl is make it a little smoother, because right now we've got some hard edges, and there were no real hard edges on on anything in real life, nor on the bowl for the chandelier that we're trying to create. So if we drop down a smooth node and connect that up, we can change the number of smoothing iterations here. Just get kind of a smoother looking bowl, and that looks pretty good. Now we need to actually put the bowl on top of the arm. As you can see, however, and you remember from our previous lesson, we can only view one object at a time, and if we want to view two objects together, we have to use a merge node and actually combine them. But before we merge it, I actually want to place the bowl where it should be. So how do we do that without being able to see where the arm is? Turns out we actually do have a way to see the arm. If you see next to the toggle visibility option, there's a purple box that says template. So if we make the arm a template, and then make the actual visibility our bowl object here, we can see that we have the bowl completely visible, and then we have this sort of wireframe ghosting of the arm, and that'll let us position the bowl in relationship to where it should be with the arm before we do the merging. So let's just go ahead and add a transform node after our smooth. If you think it's kind of odd that the bowl is down here, but the pivot center, as it were, for the transform is a bit above it, you can always select the move centroid to origin option for transform, and then it'll sort of snap the center of mass of the object to where your pivot handles are. It just makes it a little easier to work with in the viewport. So now we can put our bowl in place. This is, again, would probably be handy if we just looked at it in the front view. That way we can be absolutely sure that the bowl is placed right on top of our arm here. And the bowl also looks pretty big. Yeah, our bowl shouldn't actually be this large. So I'm just going to scale it down, probably to about there. And I'm just using the spacebar F key in order to focus in on the object like we learned in our first lesson. Spacebar 1 to go back to the perspective, and our placement looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and merge this. So, whoops. Go ahead and sort of line the nodes up and then make a merge. We can turn the template off now. So if you merge up your arm and your bowl like this, you'll notice that there's a problem. And that is we've got one bowl here and no bowls on the rest of the arms. One way to fix that would be to make another copy node. But we don't really want to do that. That'd be pretty inefficient to have multiple iterations of the same copy node. So the best way to do this is actually not to hook up the bowl to what we have before, and instead we're going to delete that merge node, make a new merge node where we just merge together the first arm we made and then the bowl, and then we'll copy that several times. So I think you can probably see now where we're going with this. We're going to, every time we keep adding details on to the arm, it's going to propagate along to the rest of them. And of course, when we change the number of copies, the details will follow along. So it's a really powerful way to be able to work with your models like this. But okay, moving on. Now that we have the bowl, let's add the candle. So we'll just go to an empty space over here, and the candle is going to be a really simple shape, right? I mean, if we look in here, it's really just a cylinder with some little wax strips on it. So to do that, we're just going to drop down a cylinder, and in Houdini, that is called a tube. So we'll make a tube, and we'll just kind of do the same thing that we did with the bowl. We'll make the tube, let's see, let's make it a mesh and give it a bunch of divisions, like 75 rows and 75 columns, which may seem like a crazy amount, but you'll see why here in a second. Let's see. Actually, we don't need its height to be that tall. Probably need to scale the radius down, move the height down a little bit. Now it will be useful to template our arm again so that we can see how big and where the candle should be at in relationship to the rest of the model. Whoops, I grabbed the wrong handle. Yeah, make sure if you're trying to move something that you're grabbing the inside handles and not the outside handles, because the outside handles will scale and the inside handles will translate. So let's just kind of roughly move it in place here. Whoops, I keep doing that. And we'll go to our front view again, just so that we can place this a little more precisely. I think we're getting kind of close. That looks pretty centered. You know, we could actually just go to the top view, now that I'm thinking of it. Whoops. Just make sure that the center of this object is right on top. So that looks pretty good. Let's just scale down the radius again. Whoops. That is too much scaling down. And then take the height down a smidge. And put it in place. We again have the problem of having a hollow piece of geometry here. So we need to make sure that with our tube selected that we have the end caps checked. That way we don't have a piece missing on the end. Now if you look at the source image, you'll see that our candle has sort of these fake wax drippings, and we need to add that too. Now we could model all of those individually. It probably wouldn't be too difficult, but there's a pretty neat way that you can actually deform an object by sort of sculpting it like clay, and that is called a it's called a Sculpt tool. So if we drop down Sculpt, hook it up to the tube, we can see we've got this this little red circle when we hover our mouse over the tube, and this red circle is actually showing us how big our sculpt brush is. So if we click and drag, it's gonna do crazy things. It's doing what we want, but not exactly how we want. If you look at the blue text at the bottom of the screen in the viewport, it'll show you exactly how to use the tool. So it says if we hold down Shift and click the left mouse button, we can change the size of the brush. So I just want to make it, you know, pretty small because the wax drippings aren't, you know, all that thick. And then the second thing is when I paint, it's still, you know, it's pushing out way too far, and the wax is just a very subtle effect. If we scroll down in our Sculpt tool, we can see under left mouse button displacement, the foreground displacement is set at 0.1. We're going to want to make this quite a bit lower, like maybe 0.01, and see how that affects it. That might even be a little too much. How about 0.005? We'll make the brush a little bit larger. That looks pretty good. So now we can just start kind of paint these fake wax drippings. If you look, they're pretty simple, just kind of straight lines that have a bit of a bigger bulge at the very end. So we can just kind of do our best job. Don't have to be super precise here. This chandelier is probably not going to be viewed very up close, otherwise you'd want to spend a lot more time making sure that the candle looks a bit better. And now the reason that we added all of those subdivisions to this to the tube is because if we use the Sculpt tool, all it's really doing is taking each vertex where these line intersects, and it's pushing it outward in the direction of the normal of the polygon we're painting on. And if we don't have a whole lot of them, then we're not going to get very accurate results. Whereas if we make a lot of subdivisions like we have here, we can have a lot more control with the brush. Now the trade-off to that is if we have too many, it's going to it's going to make the computer slow down to have all those polygons, and there could be a level where you actually crash it by adding too many. But 75 for each candle here shouldn't be at all a problem. So looks pretty good for our candle. Let's go ahead and merge that with the bowl. And in true fashion to how the rest of this lesson has been going, we're going to edit these connections once more. Instead of connecting every single detail to the same merge node, we're actually going to be doing it in groups here. So if you see this group right here was where we did our bowl, and then we have this group here which is our candle. We'll do the bowl and the candle and the flame all in one merge node, and then we'll connect that merge node to the arm. That way, whenever we need to go back and edit stuff, we just have a bit of a cleaner looking network view. So drop another merge node, connect the bowl and the candle, and then we can, merge this node down to the next merge node. Now that we have our first two details, the bowl and the candle, done, it's time to add the third detail, which is the candle flame. So if we go to our reference image and look at the flame shape, it's a pretty basic shape. It just kind of bulges out here in the middle, tapers off to a point near the top. So that's what we're going to go after here. And in order to make that shape, we're going to use a curve again. So if we drop down a curve node, and then it'll be a lot easier to draw this curve from the side view. Just make sure the curve is visible and start making this rough shape for the candle flame. Hit enter when we're done. And now the way that we're going to make this, the mesh for this, is instead of using a sweep like we did before with the arm of the chandelier, we're actually going to use a different function called revolve, which will kind of spin this curve around its y-axis and then make a shape out of the shell of the path that it took. One thing that'll be really important to note, though, is that we're going to want to revolve right around the tip of the flame. Otherwise, we may end up with a hole up here. So we'll just have to keep that in mind. So let's drop down a revolve node and go into the perspective view to see exactly what just happened. So instead of spinning the flame around the center of the candle like we wanted it to, it has spun it around the world's origin. But that's actually a pretty easy thing to fix. All we have to do is make sure that we're looking at the manipulator down here, grab it along the x-axis, and just pull it over. We can fine-tune this if we look at the top view. Just make sure that we don't have any kind of hole here in the handle. Ooh. Manipulator's kind of large and in the way. Whoop. It's very close. Let's look at it from the side view. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Yeah, just make sure that there's no hole that's visible on the top of the flame, and you should be good. We can change the shape of this a little bit if we add a smooth node. And this again works the same way that it did when we added a smooth node for the arm. If we increase the smoothing iterations, we start to lose detail here on the flame shape that we had drawn because the curve didn't have enough samples. So before the revolve node, we can just drop in a resample node here. Whoops, I have wired something up incorrectly here. Let's change the length. Right immediately when you drop the resample node in, it may break a little bit like it just did there with my curve, and that's just because of the default value it put for the length. You'll want to grab it and crank the value down pretty low. And it looks like it could stand to go even lower. It's maybe too many. That looks pretty good. We have a fair bit of detail here on the candle flame now that we've smoothed it. So the last step would be, this is a very perfect looking candle flame, and the candle flames in the photo that we're using as a reference, and then even flames in real life, they don't look perfect. Usually there's a little bit of wind, and so they're slightly deformed. What we're going to want to do is actually add we're going to add some deformation to our flame. To add deformation to the flame, we're going to use a Lattice Tool. The Lattice Tool is pretty simple to use. We need to go up here to our Deform tab and choose the Lattice Tool from the shelf. It'll prompt us to select the points we want to deform and hit Enter. So we'll select all of the flame and hit Enter, and then hit Enter one more time. Now what did that do over here? Let's make this a little larger so you can see. It has made this little mini network here of a lattice coming off of the smooth node, and it's also created a lattice bounding box and a lattice bounding box transform. And the way that we can use the Lattice Tool is if we edit the lattice bounding box transform points by just selecting the points and moving them, it will drag the underlying shape along with it. So just kind of think of it as you're moving this like the scaffolding around the object, and the object is sort of sticking to the scaffolding points. We can just kind of select things and move it around, make the shape a little wavy. It's probably too much motion up there on the top. Looks pretty decent. The bottom of our flame is kind of skinny, and we have a much fatter base here in our reference photo. So what we could actually do is select the bottom part of the lattice and just sort of scale it up a bit and then push it down. This looks pretty good. We can add one more transform node by using the revolve tool and the Lattice Tool. We've probably moved the flame a little bit off of the center here, so we can just make sure that we've got this selected properly and move the bottom of the flame back where it should be at. So now that we've finished the flame, we can go ahead and merge the flame together with the rest of our the details that we have for the arm. So we can go ahead and merge them together. It looks pretty good. And if we take a look here at our copy node, everything seems to be copying over like it should be.